Greetings and salutations, this is Huge Ass, the biggest YouTuber ever, and we're back for another one of our history times. And before I introduce my partner in crime on this one, I want to show you this little clip.
Mr. Toon, I think I'm going to head out. I think I can recognize the Antichrist when I see him. But thank you.
Eric Dubé?
No. Your friend Tony and yourself.
No, it's Eric Dubé.
You know, for me, the Antichrist is if Jesus is the fool, then the Antichrist is the narcissist, he who could never possibly consider himself a fool.
So welcome to the Antichrist himself, PhD Tony.
Never possibly consider himself
it's greetings, Hugh. Glad to be
welcome to the Antichrist himself, PhD Tony. We're getting
greetings, Hugh. Good to be with you. Greetings, Hugh. Glad to be.
Did you have the stream? Okay. Sorry.
All right, yeah, I accidentally did that. My apologies. Screwed it all up. That's how tech savvy I am.
It seems rather special to have the Antichrist as a friend.
It does. There was Mandevil who I socialized with in my teenage years was rather unhappy that he hadn't thought ahead to getting the autograph of the Antichrist. But it was
you and Toon as well, apparently. So,
well, I think he was more unhappy with me than he was with Toon. So, but he's it's one of the things that I've noticed in the past little while. Actually, it's been a while since I've been able to finish a Simon Dan video. As much as I'm wearing his hoodie today, I can't finish his videos because the people he's choosing to cover are just so clearly mentally unwell. It's very difficult to sort of watch them being dissected.
Yeah, I've noticed that recently too, because he normally stays away from the truly disturbed people, but surely there's plenty of derp out there for him to cover without having to bother with these sorts of people, unfortunately.
Well, and at least one of them, the gematria guy, who really genuinely seems quite nuts, is more or less picking a fight with him. So I can understand why he's sort of retaliating in kind. But they seem to be getting a lot worse in terms of mental health. But that's perhaps a discussion for another time.
It is. We're not on the subject of flat Earth tonight. We're on the subject of history, and particularly the history of the Saxon Kings of England. I guess there were Saxon kings back in Denmark, I guess, but these are from England. Let me just share the slide we have, and there we are with quite a few of the kings. So I just want to give a bit of a caveat to everyone. This is going to be a brief overview. I think there's about 26, 27 of them to go through. So we're just going to talk about key points about each of them. We're not trying to give a full history of each individual king that we're talking about. And so just key points and not much else. I encourage you to do your research on your own, because there are a million story threads that come off each of the stories of these kings that are absolutely fascinating. And the other thing is that the sources. Sorry,
you're starting quite late. You're skipping over Offa and a bunch of other, Horsa and Hengist, who are quite important historical figures in their own right. It's this is quite a late start for what I would consider the Anglo-Saxon period. But even so, there are lots and lots of really interesting stories.
Yeah, well, that's why I started sort of a bit late. Started with the formation of Wessex, basically, so that we could simplify it a little bit. I think the early Saxon kings is probably a whole other live stream on its own. But I think there's plenty of stories for us to cover in this one. Also, I think more people will be more familiar with the ones with particularly Alfred the Great and Edward the Confessor and people like that. Let's have a look at these, and if we like this, then we'll go back and do even earlier ones, and we'll see where we go. What's another caveat I think I need to make is the sources for information on these people. We're talking well over 1,000 years ago, when not a lot of people were literate. and the various political machinations that went on meant that the information sources are rather scarce, and what information that does survive from their reigns tends to be changed by later generations, sometimes to make those people look good, sometimes to make them look worse. So you've got to take things with a grain of salt to some extent. So the only thing we can do is tell you historians' best guesses in many cases. So check it out yourself for a good yarn, and even just the story itself is interesting. It's worthwhile having a listen to.
Just as a brief overview, an introduction, there are three main sources of evidence that we really have from the historical record. One is numismatology, which is to say coins that were issued and what were the images on the coins. There are the deeds that they signed, the grants of land, the various charters that they engaged in, and then there are what people actually wrote down. And one of the most important of that latter ones is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which only started in Alfred's reign. So Alfred himself was responsible for creating the historical record of a lot of these events. So the fact that they turn out to be quite favourable to his predecessors is perhaps not as surprising as it might be. So it's just one of those caveats. And of course, charters often got copied fraudulently by the monasteries and institutions to which they were granted to extend their rights and to increase their prestige. So you need to sort of navigate with some caution through what's going on.
Absolutely. So we're going to try and tell the story as best as we can. I'm sure Tony's going to disagree with me on a few things, so that's all part of the fun. I thought I'd start by explaining who the Saxons actually were, as you can see by this representation at least. Well, actually, I should go back further. I mean, Britain was originally inhabited by Brythonic peoples, the Britons, the ancient Britons, we usually refer to them as. And then the Romans came along in 55 BC and took it over, or took over most of it at least. And so they ruled until 410 AD, and then they buggered off back to Rome, and it didn't really help Rome much, but that's their problem. And then the Saxons, there's argument over whether it was an invasion, as in like a bloody pitched battle, or just a migration. I favour migration personally. They just saw the opportunity. There was a whole lot of stuff left over from the Romans. They were overcrowded where they were, so they decided, let's go and go to England, because England's a very fertile agricultural area. And they came from Denmark. There were three lots of peoples, the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons, and that's roughly from north to south, their lands on the Denmark Peninsula. And they just came over, and in some cases they were invited over. They acted as mercenaries to defend the Britons from other Saxons. But in the end, it was just a normal migration, and they just, is my speculation, and they eventually were outpopulated the Britons, which was interesting.
Well,
you got something to add to that,
Tony? There are a couple of interesting points to add. They seem to have been, so the Romans, before they left, set up a series of forts along the English Channel known as the Saxon forts, that were known by the Romans as the Saxon forts, that were set up to try and repel marine incursions. So the Saxons seem to have been a long-standing threat. But there were a bunch of other threats. There were the Irish coming from the west, and there were the Picts coming from the north. And the story goes, and the archaeology does something to back it up, that the Saxons were invited in to act as sort of a fast response unit in sort of central England. They could either, because they were largely mounted troops, they could quickly move to the north or to the west to respond to what was going on. And more of them came, and eventually they just decided, well, we're helping sustain this kingdom, we may as well conquer it. Interestingly, even more interestingly than that to me, is the fact that sort of the Saxons conquered France. The Franks were Saxons; they were a Germanic group, but the but they were so successful in conquering France that they basically got absorbed into French speaking. They didn't maintain an independent cultural or linguistic existence. So there's almost no cultural or linguistic influence of the Franks on France, even though the country bears that name. But in England, actually, that doesn't seem to have happened. There seems to have been a rapid initial expansion, and then they seem to have stopped for about 50 to 75 years, which would be consistent with some significant military encounter that they lost. But it's that period, a couple of generations, 2 or 3 generations, in which their language and their culture started to get traction in Britain. Excuse me. So it's the fact that they weren't as successful in England as they were in France that means that we speak English. That's why we speak English rather than a Celtic language.
Yeah, English is a hodgepodge of languages, but it's based on the Saxon languages and a good mixing of Latin languages via French as well.
Yep.
But yes, the base of it is Saxon and Old English. If you listen to it enough, you can hear the words in there that actually sounds like modern English in places. But you have to listen to it a lot to hear that. It's like speaking English with a heavy accent. And of course, there's lots of different words. And they don't have all the words we have.
I've already fascinated. I have already fascinated Clive Wells into a coma.
Yes. Well, I'm told you have that effect on people, but
I do.
I've not quite seen it. Flirts don't seem to respond that way. That's for sure.
Sadly
anyway, I just want to give a bit of context to who the Saxons were. So this is about 600 CE, which is roughly when we're starting, I guess. So they sorted themselves out into their own little kingdoms. The Britons were still around. Strathclyde, the Picts are up here in the north. Had some Britons, which were the what we call the Cornish today. They had the very good at naming their kingdoms. Like the West Saxon Kingdom was Wessex. The South Saxon Kingdom was Sussex. The Middle Saxon Kingdom was Middlesex. East Saxons were Essex. And of course, you know, the old joke, why does the University of Essex exist? So Kent girls have somewhere to go to get away from their mothers. And speaking of Kent, that was another kingdom. And East Anglia, of course, where the East Angles settled. And there's the Mercians, of course, which was probably the main rival kingdom to Wessex, as well as Northumbrians, the people above the Humber. What I particularly like about this map is it shows the sea level at the time. It was much higher than it is today, and you could get further inland via the sea, and that's how the Romans. It was a lot easier for the Romans to invade as a result. But the current outline of the coastline is there as well. You can see how much bigger the Humber was as an estuary. It was almost halfway inland, and the Wash was much bigger than it is today. And East Anglia was much more isolated, you could almost say. It was probably harder to get there. So yeah, what I particularly like is down in the west, the southwest, near where it says West in West Saxons. They've got that inland there, and that is basically where Glastonbury is. So the Glastonbury Tor, I'm sure everyone's heard of that. That used to be an island because of the sea came in all the way up to its base there. And of course, with the sea levels dropping since then, it's become all marshland there now. But it's just fascinating. There was once an island and it's so far inland.
It's worth pointing out that sea level fell in England because of the ongoing response to glacial loading, so a combination of glacial isostatic adjustment and
your specialty.
Yes, my specialty. In fact, England was the first place where I was published. Yes, I did some papers on this in the Irish Sea. With my PhD supervisor, so brings back memories. But it's also worth pointing out that at the point where we're picking up the story, Wessex and Mercia are the most important games in town in terms of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But for most of Anglo-Saxon history, this was not the case. And in fact, Kent and Northumbria were the two primary, they were the two sort of earliest great Anglo-Saxon powers, and then the Northumbrians and the Mercians. But the story we're about to tell starts with very much the decline of the Northumbrians and the Mercians.
Okay, so we've got a bit of context. Just to show, so this is about the time where we start, and it just gives you an idea of what England was like. And this is all Saxon land, basically. They had the Welsh and Strathclydes, basically the Picts and the Irish, and the rest of it was effectively just all Saxons. There's a bit of Cornwall missing off this map, I think, which was still Britain.
Yeah.
So 827, I think, was when Ecgbert started his reign. I forget why I put 802 in brackets. I think that means that's when he was born. So he was 25 when he came to the throne. He's basically the first king of Wessex. I mean, Wessex existed beforehand, but a unified Wessex. He took Mercia as well. And then he went up to Northumberland and North Wales and took them. And so he was the first one to unite all the Saxon kingdoms into one kingdom, effectively.
Well, there was a title called Bretwalda that existed before that. It was for people who were considered to be the dominant of the Anglo-Saxon kings. And for instance, Offa, after whom Offa's Dyke is named, was sort of one of the Bretwalda. Ecgbert is named as the eighth in the list of Bretwalda, and he's certainly sort of the first one from Wessex who established it. Offa, for instance, was from Mercia, and Offa was sort of making deals with Charlemagne. He was issuing gold coins. He was a very prominent player, but Ecgbert sort of comes along at the right time to establish Wessex as a presence, and as you say, he beats up the Mercians. He learnt a little. At one stage, Offa suggested himself as a bride for one of Charlemagne's daughters, I think, as a result of which Charlemagne just shut down trade with the Franks, just refused to allow the Franks to trade until he received an apology for the effrontery. And I think Ecgbert learnt a little bit of humility from all of that. But interestingly enough, he would later, I think, marry into the Frankish kingdom. Certainly, that's what I recall reading. But it kind of spelt the death knell for his maybe I'm getting him confused with Ethelwulf, so maybe I should save this story for later.
All right, we'll see. I gave him an A because that's pretty good achievements, I thought, for a king to expand his land so well and get people united. Of course, it's bloody warfare that he did it with, but that's probably not the best, but that's the way it was done back then. It doesn't make it right, but it's just what it was. So he was succeeded by his son Athelwulf. Athel is a term you'll see a lot through all the names here, and it basically means a prince, effectively. But they just built it into their name.
Yeah.
So on to Athelwulf. So he reigned for nearly 20 years. And he was the father of a lot of kings, which we'll see coming up. The Danish army, he defeated them in 1851, so he was towards the end of his reign at Oakley, not Nathan, of course. And his son Athelstan, who died before he could become king, he was in charge of the navies, and he defeated a Viking fleet off Kent, which is defeating a Viking fleet to me seems pretty significant. And he was also the father of the person who would become known as Alfred the Great. And in 1855, he took Alfred to Rome to see Pope Leo IV, which is interestingly just a few months later, Leo died. But then again, it's a time when people die all the time, a lot. But I think this trip to Rome was particularly significant because if you're leaving your kingdom to go for a trip to Rome for ecclesiastical reasons, then you must feel pretty secure that the nation's in good hands, to leave your country and go elsewhere. It didn't turn out that way, as we'll see on the next slide.
If I may, you've actually conflated. Alfred made 2 trips to Rome, one with his dad, but one on his own. So he got sent along with Ethelred as emissaries to Rome, which is where they met Pope Leo, and then they came back, and then Ethelwulf took Alfred again. By that stage, Leo was dead, and on his way back, so I was right and wrong at the same time. I did get confused. On his way back, he married into the lineage of Charlemagne, and that was at that marriage ceremony, his wife was consecrated as queen, and this was something that was not well accepted by the Wessex nobility. The notion that a queen might have any say whatsoever in what was going on was not something that they were at all comfortable with. Obviously, from the Frankish perspective, they weren't going to send her off to some dunghill in southern England if she wasn't going to have any say in anything. So to them, it was obvious that she should be consecrated as queen. But the people in Wessex seem not to have liked it, or at least this was their excuse for not welcoming Ethelwulf back. The other reason, of course, was Ethelbald had gotten quite used to being in charge, thank you very much, and didn't see why he should give his kingdom back. No, Clive Wells, Pope Leo did not operate a tower crane at the it's a good
comment
guess.
of the night. Yes. All right. Yes. So again, he was repelled all borders, you might say. He was able to keep the country fairly safe. He gave birth to a whole bunch of kings. Not him personally, but he fathered a whole bunch of kings. Sadly, all of them died before they had children, except Alfred. But they all got their chance of being king, and I didn't see any reason not to give him an A, to be honest.
Well, he got kicked out.
Bad, I saw.
He got kicked out by his. Mostly there was a consensus that Ethelbald was doing quite well in charge, and he got deposed and put in charge of Kent, and so he died sort of being a client king, having started out as an actual king. So. It's a weird.
Well, it's a bad end to a good reign.
Yeah. Well, to me, the test of a good king is somebody who does something on an administrative or organizational level that improves things, and there's not a lot of organizational stuff that these people do that sort of makes the country or the institution of the of Wessex any stronger. So I think you're being a bit generous, but that's how I grade monarchs. You're entitled to be wrong. There's no law against it.
I think it's a little bit different for the Saxon kings, though, because at their time, England was considered personal property. They weren't there trying to make it good for the people. The people were just there to generate taxes for it. And that's the approach they took. They're working their land.
But the weakness of that approach was being demonstrated to them in real time. So the fact that they didn't sort of see the need to reform stuff. And we're going to see that their attitude was not a good fit for the circumstances in which the kingdom found itself. So they needed to really get their act together, and not many of them did. So
no, Alfred's probably the best one at that, both militarily and organisationally and societally, I guess, if that's a word. But we'll talk about him when we get to him. All right, so we've talked about Ethelbald. He was only in there for a couple of years. So he forced his dad to abdicate, said, all right, you can go rule Kent, and then married his stepmother Judith, who Ethelwulf had married. But that didn't amount to anything either, and they didn't have any kids, and then he just died. So C- for me.
And Judith pissed off back to France, much to the relief of everybody. Judith was the bride that Ethelwulf had picked up on his way through France, and who had, and many people blamed for Ethelwulf being deposed, but really that seems like an excuse more than anything else. Anyway, he didn't achieve a hell of a lot, it has to be said.
No, he was very reasonably indulgent, I'd say. But he was succeeded by his brother Ethelbert, Ethelbert maybe. Again, another fairly short reign of 6 years or so. But again, the Danes are coming over the ocean and trying to invade Britain, and they got as far as Winchester, the capital of Wessex at this point, and sacked Winchester. But then he fought them off again, and he didn't have much luck. The year before he died, the great heathen army of so many Danes that just basically occupied the eastern half of Britain landed in 865 in Kent, I think it was, or East Anglia, one or the other, and just spread out and created havoc wherever they went. And not the best thing when you're a king, but up until that point, he wasn't doing too bad. You're muted, Tony. You're still muted. Can I do it?
Okay,
Yeah.
StreamYard decided to screw me.
I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Vikings started raiding England in the late 8th century, 792, 793, round about there is the first recorded raid. But after a while, they began to realize that actually if they could get a large force, the English would have a lot of trouble kicking them out. And this great heathen army, it settled in East Anglia. It made a deal with the East Anglians, and then it moved into Northumbria and conquered Northumbria, which was in the grips of its own sort of civil war. And it ended the existence of Northumbria as an independent entity. So they found themselves in control of fairly large swathes of what would today be considered England, and they presented a very serious problem. They were highly mobile, they were extremely ruthless, and then
Nope, you've gone mute again.
Yeah, well, they were just very good at what they did. This StreamYard seems not to like me sometimes. Anyway, carry on.
The thing about the Great Heathen Army to mention is that people who've watched the TV show Vikings, I should say Netflix show, will know that Ivor the Boneless and who was the youngest son of Ragnar? They were leading it basically. So,
Guthrum, Uber.
Yeah, there was other ones. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Guthrum was probably the most successful.
Yeah, Guthrum was the person who ended up in charge of sort of the Viking forces that Alfred would eventually be contesting. Ivar the Boneless seems to have been a particularly ruthless individual. If you've played Assassin's Creed Valhalla, you'll have come across these characters, and also The Last Kingdom, which is a television series. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of source material out there if you're interested in this particular portion of history.
Like I said, there's a million threads to follow off these, which are all interesting stories in themselves. So it's worthwhile having a look. All right. So when Athelbert went, Athelred the first, because there was a couple, moved into his brother's shoes. And again, he fought with Danes all through his reign. He had the Great Heathen Army to deal with. I can't remember if I can't read my own notes now. In 866, York occupied. Does that mean he occupied York, or were the Vikings occupying it? I can't remember now.
I think that was York occupied by the
Vikings.
the Vikings, yeah. As I say, they went in.
And they turned it into their base basically for the next couple of hundred years. And he had several battles with the Danes. Alfred fought alongside him. And unfortunately, after his last battle at Meriton, he died from his wounds, and it passed on to Alfred the Great.
It's worth making a point here that Ethelred and Alfred had come to an agreement not to contest rulership of Wessex with Ethelbald, was it the previous ruler? And Alfred had agreed Ethelbert, sorry. And Alfred had agreed not to contest his Athelred's rule while Athelred was on the throne. So they sort of came to this agreement that, okay, we could bicker about what's going on here, but if we do that, we're going to get absorbed into this Viking kingdom. So we need to not bicker. We need to not be picking fights with one another. And so there's this clear, this surprisingly clear line of succession where sort of Alfred gets to succeed uncontested. Athelred gets to concede uncontested, and because everybody realizes now this is actually a big threat. Things can go badly wrong because 866 to 871. By this stage, the Great Heathen Army had basically turned Mercia into a client state and conquered East Anglia throughout this period. So Wessex was obviously next in line, and they knew that they were in a lot of trouble.
Yep. If they did keep bickering, the Vikings would have taken over, and they'd all get the blood equal, and they probably didn't want that. So anyway,
Ashdown there, that battle is a famous battle at which Alfred established himself as a military leader, because sort of the Anglo-Saxon army divided into two divisions, and Alfred's division went into battle and was basically left on its own. The story is that Ethelred wouldn't enter the field of battle until he'd finished his prayers, as a result of which Alfred and his corps were basically being pummeled by every Viking, between here and Denmark. But he managed to hold them off until Athelred came in and won the day. So sort of Alfred was seen as a bit of a war hero by this stage.
Yeah, obviously Athelred and Athelbert were as well. Athelred in particular, because he died from his wounds. He was obviously in the thick of it all the time, as they were back in those days. Yes. So this one, unlike the previous ones, I've been mostly putting 14th century representations, which obviously were contemporary. This is a coin, which means this is a contemporary image of Alfred, even though it's very stylized, of course. So he was So his issue is probably the things I want to talk about first, not so much Edward the Elder, because we'll talk about him in the moment, who succeeded him, but Athelflaed, I presume that's the way you pronounce it. I'll probably butcher all these pronunciations. She was married off to the King of Mercia, and that made Mercia a very strong ally for Wessex. And in fact, when her husband died, she was made the Lady of the Mercians. And she was basically running military campaigns for Alfred as a client state, you might say. So very good ally for Alfred. Alfred's sister, that was. And, daughter?
Daughter, I think. Edward's sister, I think.
And Aelfwith, it's hard to pronounce that one. She was married off to somewhere in Europe, and it's not coming to me now. But again, Alfred maintained really good relationships with the people in Europe as well, which was always good, so that they're not invading you and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's kind of like the first, through reading through these things, it's kind of like the first example of where they use marriage for political reasons more than anything else. Which I thought was interesting.
It's not exactly the first. I mean, you could see.
I'm sure it's not the first, but it was the first one I could pick out.
Athelwulf really wanted to be married to Judith because of the influence that she would bring, and the potential validation of the Carolingian court, which was highly sought after. But yeah, it's certainly one of the examples of sort of the English exporting a wife to, being considered worthwhile enough to export a wife to the continent rather than the other way around. But yeah, one thing you've left out here is that he was actually physically frail. It was not. He suffered from a serious physical ailment for most of his adult life that kind of undermined people's confidence in him. But there's a lot of stories here.
Well, burning some cakes is one of them. At one point, Alfred and his followers were pushed back to just some marshes in southern England, and the Danes basically had the rest of England. So he was sort of like at his wit's end, and he came across this woman who was cooking some cakes, and she asked him to watch them, and he burned them, and she scolded him, and that's often repeated and taught to school children these days as a way that even the king can be told off.
It's an oft-repeated tale, and the message of it seems to have been that actually a lot of the trouble that had fallen on the kingdom was as a result of not focusing on the important present problems, not being in the moment and addressing the and making sure that disaster didn't come. That seems to as luck would have it, I'm reading a biography of Alfred the Great at the moment. And it's interesting. So he lost a very decisive battle, but he also seems to have been ousted from power. Basically, there seems to have been a rebellion. Now, this sort of parallels what happened in Mercia. In Mercia, sort of the Vikings would show up and they'd say, okay, if you want us to piss off, you need to pay us a lot of money. And so the king rounded up a lot of money, threw it at the Danes, and the Danes immediately just pissed off to a different part of the kingdom and said, well, we're here now, and actually these guys are our friends, and we think they'd make better kings than you would. And that happened to Beorhtric, I think, who was the king of Mercia at the time. And he ended up leaving and going to Rome. He sort of went into self-imposed exile and went to Rome, which is where he died. And more or less the same thing happened seems to have happened to Alfred. And we need to be a bit careful here because we're hitting on the limits of our historical record. But he turns up for a particular for a particular council meeting at Easter, and the Vikings are said to have surprised him. Now, there's no battle described, there's no deaths recorded, and there's no real discussion of how it was that a Viking army managed to make it to where the king was without the king noticing. But it's worth noticing that once Alfred is forced into retreat, he's basically dispossessed, and the Vikings set up a puppet government. Now, one of the reasons that this may have happened was because of the money he had to give to the Vikings. In order to give the Vikings money, he took money off a lot of people, in particular the church, who were pretty bloody upset about the entire thing. And they seem to have come to the conclusion, look, it turns out that having the Vikings in charge in Yorkshire isn't so bad. The bishop of, the Archbishop of York, he's doing perfectly fine. So why don't we have them in charge here? It will be less expensive for us in the long run. And so there seems to have been this sort of movement amongst a few of the senior nobles and senior figures in Wessex to basically kick him to the curb and replace him with a puppet. At which point he and a bedraggled band basically retreated to this island in a swamp called Athelney, the Prince's Island, that's the period in which this burning the cakes story emerges from. But the period involved is only about 7 weeks before he summons the Third, and they basically, to the surprise of most people, they all show up. So in that 7 weeks, he's been doing these raids to sort of just harass the Vikings in the way that they had been harassing him. And then, and letting everybody know, well, I'm not doing a Beorhtric. I'm not pissing off to Rome. I'm still king. You swore to obey me, and I'm not abandoning the kingdom. And it turned out to work. It turned out that actually he was very popular. He was able to summon a Third, and they did score a decisive victory.
Yeah, at the Battle of Edington.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when things turned around. And the main story here, for me at least, is that Alfred went from having nearly nothing to basically getting most of his kingdom back. Not all of England, of course. They settled a truce. Even after Edington, the Danes couldn't really field a force against him anyway, not straight away at least. And so they had to do peace. And so they had the Danelaw was sort of the north part of England, and Wessex remained under control of Alfred. And one of his... Yeah, go on.
Sorry. Well, in negotiating this peace, one of the things that had been sort of quite notable was that the Vikings would swear oaths on anything you offered them. Saints' relics, stuff that was supposed to be holy to them, like Thor's arm ring. You could ask them to offer hostages, and they just didn't care. They'd turn around and they'd screw you over at the first opportunity they had. They simply didn't regard their word as, worthy of anything. If you were gullible enough to accept that, more fool you. So what Alfred decided was he would basically make all of the senior Vikings in Guthrum's army convert to Christianity, and he'd serve as he served as godfather to Guthrum, and he gave him gifts, and he said, look, why don't you go off and be king in the north there, and I can help you out. I can send you gifts, I can send you embassies, we can work trade together, we can strike coins together, which indeed they did. The London Mint struck coins for both Guthrum and for Alfred. So, he basically sort of dragged the Vikings into, well, you're kings now. You can't do this Viking thieving rubbish. You got to be, in charge of your place and run it like a kingdom, and we can both get along and we can both get rich, which they did. So,
yes. Part of his strategy, though, was to start burhs, what's called burhs or burgs. and hence why so many place names have burg in them, like Edinburgh and Peterborough and places like that, which were basically fortified townships. So that when the Danes do come raping and pillaging, they can all be inside the burg and be protected and have stores left over for sieges and things like that, and then fire arrows out at the Vikings and things like that. And that sort of negated the Vikings' battle strategy to a large extent, and helped the people to survive. And if you lose your people, you're not going to have a lot of sources for people for your armies or to grow your crops for food for the armies or whatever. So that was his innovation. Yeah.
He also helped establish the concept of a navy, and he sort of better formalized the military service that was required of everybody and the equipment that they needed to have on hand. So he, I talked about this earlier, but sort of the administrative and the cultural influence. Like I say, he was the first person to, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our primary source of history for this period, owes its existence to Alfred. He wanted stuff recorded. He wanted, English literature, English poetry, written down and recorded. And a lot of what we know about this period of history is because of Alfred's policy decisions and the way he chose to organize his kingdom. It was in almost every respect, militarily, administratively, educationally, and culturally, it's just a roaring success.
So I believe you agree with my A+ rating then.
I am going to give you an A. I am going to agree with your A+ rating. He does deserve.
That's one down.
Okay.
Yes. The one thing I haven't heard said is that Alfred was particularly recorded things, I guess, is related to that, but he promoted education. He wanted as many people to be educated as possible. He himself learned to read at the age of 12, and I guess it opened up a whole new world for him, and he just wanted other people to share in that as well. But also he probably realized later on, unless you record things, you can't really communicate that on. So that's why he set up things like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and so on. At least that's my speculation. Now, there's just one more point on Alfred I want to make at least. He has the epithet of the Great, which was assigned to him in the 16th century. I couldn't find a more precise time than that, but that sort of suggests maybe in the reign of Henry VIII, certainly in the Tudors. And I know Henry VIII was expecting people to remember him as Henry the Great. And I wonder if he sort of promoted Alfred the Great as a sort of like a precursor. Yes, well, you can call Alfred that, so you can call me that as well. I don't know. I'm just purely speculating. But.
It would have served. I think it would have served Henry's political purposes in terms of establishing independence from the continent to Lord Alfred. But I don't know that. I just don't know who it was who came up with the idea of calling him great.
No, I have to look into that a bit more detail, but I couldn't find a more precise date than the 16th century. But we'll see. But that was interesting. Now, we're talking about the Danelaw, and this map illustrates that. So you can see the bits that the Danes had in control of. The Saxons still had Northumbria. Mercia sort of existed as part of Wessex, and then Wessex and its dependencies down the bottom. So you can see the line that was drawn there. And that stayed that way, moving backwards and forwards for the next couple of 100 years or so, or maybe 100 years. Ebon Ironside, then Canute took all of it over, and then it went back to Edward the Confessor. But we'll tell that story when we get there.
Well, we'll tell that story when we get there. But it's worth noting that there are a couple of things that we still get from the Danelaw. For instance, the idea of there being 12 people on a jury. That's Danish in origin.
Yep. Okay. So that map was in the reign of Edward the Elder, who succeeded Alfred. He reigned for quite a long time, 25 years, which was a long time for those times. So he had again 3 kings were his issue. He teamed up with Mercia. His aunt was running Mercia, and defeated Northumbria. his sister was running Mercia.
Yeah.
Defeated Northumbria, fought back against the Vikings, furthered what Alfred had done, and he laid foundation for a south-centered England, is what one commentator said. And I think he's right, because he was a very good administrator and everything like that. He was very much like his father, I thought. Whereas Alfred started with near nothing and took it to something, he took it from something to almost everything, is the way I'm thinking of it.
Well, one of the things that he saw was the need to persevere with Alfred's policies and carry them through, and adapt them. So a lot of times you see sort of, oh well, that's a nice idea. Oh, the crisis seems to have passed. Let's get back to bickering with one another again. Edward was not one of those people, and he and Ethelflaeth really did a lot to stabilize the concept of England. If they hadn't sort of been sound and solid and dependable successes, Alfred's gains would have been for nothing.
Yeah. And they all put a lot into Alfred's gains, so it was good that they carried on under his son. And that's why I gave him an A+. He basically continued Alfred's reign for another 25 years. So another interesting point is that they don't really know where Alfred and Edward are buried, because they were buried in a particular monastery, but under Henry VIII, that monastery was dissolved, and sort of various. It's a military base now, because Time Team did an episode on this. But so they have a general idea of where it is, but they don't know where their remains are at all. So maybe one day they'll be found. Who knows?
That would be interesting if they could be, but yeah.
So the next one to start off with is a little strange. Some historians think his name was Athelstan, but he might have had the name Athelweird as well. And others say that Athelstan had a half-brother called Athelweird, who died just a few weeks after Edward died. And so sort of got lost from the line of succession and went to Athelstan anyway. But yeah, this is what I mean when I said at the beginning I was giving caveats that we don't have all the data necessarily. So I guess you'd have to read the sources and make your own mind up as to what actually happened for Athelstan to get to the throne. But he was there for 15 years, which is a fair way for this time and age. He didn't have any children, though. For 15 years, you'd think he'd get a few. And he was the first person proclaimed King of the English. In fact, there's something I didn't say under Alfred. He was the King of Wessex, and then he was given the title King of the Anglo-Saxons. And Edward had that title as well. And then Athelstan became called King of the English. So people started calling themselves English rather than Anglo-Saxons.
Rather than West Saxons or South Saxons, or
thinking of themselves as one people. I guess that's partly what I meant by Edward had a focused nation in the south. In that regard, they started becoming the same people, or one people.
Yeah, he's the first. He's generally recognised as the first, but there are sort of a succession after him who don't really make it onto the list of people who are really accepted. So we'll see. I've got a list. I've got a list of English king biographies behind me, and Ethelstan is followed by Ethelred. So they don't regard any of the other ones as particularly noteworthy, or certainly not noteworthy enough to get their own biography.
Mm-hmm. So he completed the work of Alfred and Edward and ended all the Viking kingdoms in Britain at the time by conquering York in 927, just a few years after he came to power. He got the Scots to submit to him. Constantine II submitted to him. Not that they were happy about it. After the Battle of Brunanburh. I don't know.
Yeah.
I never know how to pronounce these things. Like his grandfather and father, he was very pious, and he did a lot of work, something you like, Tony, to centralise government So to me, this has been a bit of a golden age for England. These 3 kings in a row, I think they're all A+ ones because they've done so much for their country. They went from nothing to something, something to everything, and then consolidated on that and set the tone for the future. That's the way I look at it, at least anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't disagree?
No, I don't disagree at all, Scott. I've read the biography of him, and all that I can remember about it is in the notes there. He was indeed a very pious person who did a lot to sort of centralize government. There's a lot of speculation about his relationships with various particular bishops and so on, but
I think
nothing
one with Dunstan. Dunstan became a bit of a problem at points. I think he's coming up soon, but I'm not sure this was the first first king for Dunstan. Okay, so he was succeeded.
It is worth making one note here. At this stage in history, the most famous and highly thought of saint in England is St. Cuthbert, and the Battle of Brunanburh, which you just referenced, is considered to be one of the miracles that St. Cuthbert was responsible for. And it wouldn't. So eventually, St. Cuthbert would be replaced by Thomas Becket, but that's still many centuries in the future at this stage. At this stage, St. Cuthbert was the be-all and end-all of English saints up in Durham. Yeah, they'd moved to Durham by this stage.
All right, awesome. So yeah, he had a bit of a battle with the Vikings as well. Lost York in the 5 boroughs, which were Leicester, Stamford, Derby, I think was one. I can't remember them. You might remember them better than me, Tony. The 5 boroughs. It was kind of like that chunk in eastern central Britain, and there were 5 main towns, that sort of area, and they were the centres of trade, so they're things worthwhile taking, and York as well as the Viking base, and but then Edmund fought back and took them back. So he lost him, which to me takes him below an A. But he got him back, so he sort of evened out. He maintained good relations with the continent and overhauled legislation, so he was a good administrator in that regard, and that's why I gave him a B+.
Yeah, I have to say I don't know much about Edmund, so yeah.
So his successor, he had children, Eadwig and Edgar, but his successor was his brother Edred, because Edmund died when his children were infants, basically. And infants can't rule, so his brother took over, which was rather nice for him. And unlike most brothers in these situations, he worked hard to make sure that there was a kingdom for his nephews to inherit, which makes Edred, to me, a pretty good bloke. He didn't have any children of his own. He expelled Eric Bloodaxe from York, so one of the most famous Vikings. He fought back and got rid of him. And unfortunately, age 32, which was actually not far off old age in those days. You sort of lived to about 40, 50 at the most. And he died of ill health then at 32. So, I thought he's a B- at least. It seemed.
Don't have any
9 years. So,
as you say, a lot of brothers would have taken the opportunity to kill their nephews and sort of take over the kingdom. He didn't do that, so that's reasonable.
So when he died, one of his nephews, the first one, Edgar, succeeded, and he was just 15 when this is where Dunstan comes in. Dunstan was he wasn't Archbishop of Canterbury, but he was like the major cleric in the in Britain at the time. And I just noticed Truth Nerds has popped in. Hello, Truth Nerds, one of my members. Always good to see you. So yeah, he was, and when he got crowned, the story goes, he was mucking around with Aelf Gifu, I guess that's the way you pronounce it, out the back when everyone was in the party, and that woman's daughter as well. And Dunstan came out, and because he was the holy man, he berated Edgar for being bad. And Edgar wasn't very happy with Dunstan, and Dunstan had to go into exile eventually, but came back to be Edgar, his brother's advisor later on. But Edward was well known for his generosity in giving away land, which kind of indicates that he was very insecure. So he came to the throne at 15 and died at 19. So he wasn't around for very long, and he didn't do much with what he had.
Yeah. So it was quite common practice to sort of bribe people by giving them lots of land if you could afford to do it. And like I was saying, the charters in which that land is sort of parceled out, they tell us a lot about what's going on. But people who weren't very secure that they had the support of the nobility would dedicate a lot of effort to trying to buy them off. So that's how that's often interpreted by historians of the period.
Yeah, I think in this case, you've got to remember Edgar was a teenager, and what he gave away was about 5% of the land of his kingdom. So he was really desperate to buy favour. Yeah. So all to no avail. He eventually died of whatever he died of. It was quite common to die young in this day and age, and his brother took over and had quite a long reign.
It's surprisingly common to die of whatever you die of. It's an almost universal cause of death.
Yes, death is fatal.
Yep.
So his brother Edgar, he also was 15 when he ascended to the throne, or around about that, because they're never quite sure when their birth dates are and that kind of thing. And he had two kings in his children, Edward the Martyr and Athelred the Unready. So Edgar reunited the kingdom. That's why he had the epithet the Peaceful, because he was able to get everyone to work together again. Dunstan, unlike his brother, Dunstan was his best mate and his chief advisor. So, a lot of the decisions of the realm, Dunstan influenced heavily. The coronation ceremony, as we know it today, was started with Edgar when he got crowned, and Dunstan had a big hand in that as well. And also Edgar's standardized measurement, which is a very significant thing. Because if you say a foot is this long and your neighbour says, no, it's this long, you get quite a few arguments. But Edgar managed to introduce standardized measurement, and pretty much I'm imagining that's the imperial measurement that he introduced. I'm not sure if the Saxons had a different measurement.
There would be some variation of it, but one of the most important elements of standardizing measurement would be trade with France. French. The French have particular standards about what goods they required.
Mm-hmm.
And hello to Peter Nottle in the chat.
Oh, who's that? Peter Nottle. Oh, hey, Peter. I saw you in my live stream on Thursday. All right. So Edgar had quite a long reign, relatively. I thought he did pretty well, considering he started off as a boy. Edward the Martyr, who had quite a short reign. And he was like his dad. He was just a kid when he was ascended to the throne. But in the end, he was murdered. And he was probably murdered by his stepmother, Athelred the Unready's mother, who was his father's second wife. And she murdered him so that Athelred could become the king. That's the theory, at least. Many people consider Edward the Martyr as a saint, but the Catholic Church never recognized him as a saint. He was never canonized. And because he was only there for 3 years and there's so much controversy with the murder and that sort of thing, there's not a lot of more information other than that. I think only 3 charters of his have survived. So we don't have a lot of information on Edward the Martyr's reign as king for between the ages of 13 and 16.
Yep.
So I haven't really given a score as a result. A bit hard to give a score on something you don't know much about. I don't know if you know anything more, Tony.
No, I don't know. Don't know much more. I do know a bit more about Ethelred the Unready.
Well, good.
We can.
Well, let's go on to him.
Yeah. Okay.
So
First of all, Ethelred the Unready is a bad translation of his title. He was known as Ethelred the Unread, but in the language of the time, unread means ill-advised. Well, you've got it all up there, haven't you? He wasn't generally considered, as incompetent as he has gone down later to be considered. Everybody thinks of him as sort of the king that lost England to the Danes, but that's not really fair to him. It's not really. It's hard to see how many people would have done better in the situation that he ended up with. By this stage, the Danes were a formidable military force, and England was not really well positioned to resist.
Just a little bit more on his name. Apparently, it was applied after his death. It wasn't anything that his contemporaries knew, calling him the Unready. It's meant to be a pun because the name Ethelred means well-advised. So well-advised, ill-advised. For some reason, the Saxons must have thought that was funny. So that's what one historian source I saw said. So the biggest, you're saying, lost at England, his main protagonist was Canute, whose name, if you rearrange the letters, spells Nathan Oakley.
I see what you did there.
Yes, but under Ethelred, England grew and prospered, really. Grew in population and trade and wealth. And so it was England were pretty much better off because of Ethelred, despite the conflict with the Danes going on and Canute invading. I presume I'm pronouncing Canute correctly, but if I'm not, that's what I'm going to go with. For a short period, a few years. Sorry?
I spoke to a Dane once, and they Canute, and got some weird pronunciation of it, and they laughed.
It sounded like an owl.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're right.
The Swedes say that Danish is not a language; it's a throat condition. We don't need to listen to what they say.
It's a bit like Welsh, then. Some people say. Anyway, so one thing to point, about 3 years before Ethelred was died, Sven Forkbeard, one of the Vikings, and one of the sons of the kings of Norway and Denmark, invaded and briefly took the crown for a few months. That was his stated objective. He took the crown and got crowned King of England. But then Ethelred fought back and took it back, and until he died in 1016. He was succeeded by probably one of the kings I actually quite liked the most. I like the idea. It's Edmund too, but he was given the epithet Ironside because he was so ferocious in battle against the Danes, fighting with his father, or for his father, really. I quite like the idea of the ultimate warrior king, you might say. But he was only king for a few months, from April till November in 1016, and then he died in a battle. He did manage to forge a peace with Canute, and Canute had major respect for Edmund because he was so ferocious in battle, and that's what Vikings like to see. And in fact, when Edmund died, Canute laid a cloak of peacock feathers on him, because peacocks are a symbol of resurrection. And that it's a bit like Saladin and Richard, that sort of respect between enemies, and it's always good to see. But that didn't stop Canute raping and pillaging his way across Britain. But yeah, Edmund and he came to an agreement and stopped at a certain point, and split the kingdom, and they had peace for a while until Edmund died, and then Canute became king of all of England.
Yes.
And a point to make is that Edmund had two children, Edmund and Edward, and Canute exiled them. He didn't kill them or anything. He just exiled them. Edward, I think it was Edmund who died, but Edward survived and lived to a ripe old age. And when the Battle of Hastings happened, they tried to bring Edward back to be the king and compete against William the Conqueror. But he wasn't really interested in it, I think.
Well,
and they sort of got rid of it after a while.
Really work. I think he ended up in Hungary.
Yeah, he didn't have much support for that against the Conqueror. So, but we're still quite a few kings away from the end, and you can see we're 60 years away from that. So yeah, there's quite a few kings to come still. And of course, Canute himself, he reigned for quite a while as well as king of all of England. His successor was his son Harold. Notable issue: he had two kings, Harold and Harthacnut, and Harthacnut ruled in Denmark as Canute II. So yeah, Canute was son of Sven Forkbeard and grandson of Harold Bluetooth, after which Bluetooth systems are named.
Yep.
And the famous story about Canute is he tried to say, command the tide to not come in. And of course, he got rather wet. And apparently, it wasn't that he thought he was so great that he could command the tide. It was actually trying to show his nobles that, hey, I'm just a man. I can't command the tide. So he did it as a demonstration of that, because they were being yes men, I guess.
So some of his advisors were trying to encourage him to some, policy decisions that he didn't think he could back up in reality. And so the story goes that he did this, and he made his successors, he made his advisors stand with him in the tide. That's how the story goes, anyway. How true that is, you can't really say, but it's a lot of
apocryphal stories.
Yeah, that's how the story goes. I'm a bit surprised, but yeah, he seems to have been a decent enough ruler. He was a conqueror. He was a Viking, but he was in charge. But he was in charge for 19 years, and I mean, it's not like every English person in the kingdom died. He was a reasonably good ruler for the period. One of the I think I'm going to take issue with one of the kings that's going to come along in a second, but we'll see when we get there.
All right, that's Canute. So his son Harold, who probably wasn't supposed to be king at all, it was supposed to be Harthacnut, because Harthacnut took Denmark and that sort of thing by birthright, of course. But Harthacnut was busy putting down conflicts over there. So he said, "Oh, Harold, you go be king for a while." And Harold was supposed to be a regent, but he went out of his way to find someone to put a crown on, he said, and make him actually officially the king. And he also he had a stepbrother, Alfred. Canute, I think, married the widow of Athelred the Unready, and had Alfred, but Harold probably must have saw him as a threat and had him murdered. And Earl Godwin, whose name is going to come up very soon, was an ally, a Dane who had a very large area of Britain and the wealthiest man in Britain, at least at one stage, was an ally of Harold. And boy, did he pick the wrong person to support.
Well, I mentioned earlier that sort of one of the styles of historical figure that I don't like are the types of people who decide to start bickering over internal distributions of wealth and thereby weaken the entire country. Earl Godwin is the poster child of that sort of historical figure. This guy can single-handedly lay claim to destabilizing England sufficiently for the Norse conquest to occur. And I mean, we're about to get to another king who also bears a little bit of responsibility for what's getting on. But Earl Godwin was a bit of a jerk. Also, Truth Nerds, Bluetooth never married. He had trouble connecting. We all see what you did.
Yes.
Bluetooth, of course, is named after Harold Bluetooth. Because it was actually a placeholder name developed by the developer. Like they were coming up with all of these communication protocols for devices, and somebody said, "Well, I'm working on one. We can use this as the standard, and we'll call it Bluetooth because Harold Bluetooth united all of Denmark and Norway and Sweden, and connected them all. So he brought everything together. Therefore, we should name this thing Bluetooth, and it stuck. We never got rid of it."
Yes, most people don't know that. And Bluetooth would have been he had a dead nerve in one of his teeth or something. And of course, they didn't have good dentists in the Viking area. So, that's how we got that name. So the murder of Alfred is significant because when Harthacnut eventually got around to taking his throne in England, especially when Harold died, he dug up Harold and publicly decapitated him for the murder of Alfred because it upset his mum. So, when he did come, he came with an invasion force. I thought that was fascinating because he was taking no chances whatsoever. I'm not just, you've invited me to be your king? Yeah, I'll come, but I'm just going to make sure I've got people backing me up. But, it was peaceful in the end. He did what he did to Harold's body. I talked about that. But he was only about 32, but it's thought that he died a few years later of a stroke, which is interesting because it was caused by drinking too much. He was apparently drinking at this feast and drank some and then just collapsed and had convulsions and died, which is one story. Another story is that towards the end of his reign, he was actually quite ill and he knew that. And he actually invited Edward the Confessor, who was the son of Athelred the Unready, to come back to England from exile and become king when Harthacnut passed away. And that's exactly what happened. But before we go on that, do you want to say anything about Harthacnut, Tony?
Not really. Again, not much in the way of particular accomplishments. In terms of sort of administrative or organizational innovations. Doesn't seem. It seems to have been an okay individual. Doesn't seem to have been particularly vicious or brutal, but not particularly remarkable either.
Yep, and that's why I gave a C. So Edward the Confessor. So after having a couple of Danes, we bring back one of the Saxons, even though all the Saxons are really Danes anyway. So he reigned for quite a while, but despite that, didn't have any children. Unlike Edward the Martyr, he was actually canonized about 100 years later. He was, like I said, he was exiled by Canute, who was his stepfather, because Canute married the widow of Athelred. And then he invited him back to Canute's son, Harthacnut, invited Edward back to rule once he passed away. Because Godwin had supported Harold instead of Harthacnut, Godwin was not in the books with Harthacnut, and that continued over to Edward. And Edward didn't really sort out the succession very well, and that's what led to the Battle of Hastings, basically.
Yeah, this is the other pincer of what I was referring to earlier. So you had Earl Godwin, who was an immensely wealthy and influential figure who had he had Harold Godwinson, he had Seward Godwinson,
Tostig.
who was and Tostig, who themselves were incredibly powerful landowners. And he forced Edward the Confessor to marry one of his daughters. And Edward the Confessor basically refused to have anything to do with her. one of the stories behind that is that he was such a holy person that he sort of eschewed physical relationships with women. But the other side of it is he just didn't want one of Godwin's grandchildren on the throne. And he seems to have known that failing to provide an heir was destabilizing the kingdom. And given the conviction with which William the Conqueror insists that Edward the Confessor and Harold Godwinson promised him the throne, it's hard to believe that it's hard to believe that he would make up that story out of whole cloth. So it seems likely that am I misremembering, or did Edward the Confessor later go on to marry William the Conqueror's sister?
No, he
I
was.
think
I thought he was dead before then. I'm looking up.
So Sandra recalls some woman named Emma who is some relation of William the Conqueror. All of these get confusing because everybody has the same name.
Yeah, all those Athels for a start. Spouse, Edith of Wessex was the only spouse recorded here.
Right.
It might be wrong, but who knows?
1045 to 1066. So that's
Yeah, she was a daughter of Godwin. So
yeah.
So he was. Yeah, so Edward apparently was trying to keep Godwin's line off the throne, and it didn't work because when Edward passed away, the English nobles got together, and most of them were scared of Godwin, so they picked. Well, actually, Godwin was dead by then, I think. So Harold was Godwin, basically, and Godwin's son, because he was son of Godwin, and he managed to be able to get the nobles to make him king. And of course, that pissed off Bill the Norman, and the rest is history. But I thought Harold.
There are.
I was just going to say Harold had some notable achievements by he was waiting down the southern coast of England for William, and then he heard about Harold Hardrada attacking the north of England, so he marshaled his army all the way up there, won that battle of Stamford Bridge, and then came all the way back to Hastings to face William. So I thought that was a pretty significant event as a military leader.
So Harold Godwinson is an interesting case because legally he had no claim to the throne. You had to be of what were called the Athelings. You had to be a princeling in order to be considered to be King of England. So the concept of kingship was that provided you were born into the Atheling family, the nobles of the kingdom would get together and they would select one of those Athelings to be king. We've sort of skirted around this as though it passes uncontested from father to son or brother to brother or what have you. But that's not how it worked, and that's not how the English thought of kingship. So Harold Godwinson wasn't an Atheling and had no claim to be considered for the kingship, but realistically, he was the most powerful person in the kingdom, and there was really no other candidate to stand up, so they elected him. It's also the Battle of Stamford Bridge that he won, fighting off Harold Hardrada. One of Harold Hardrada's allies was Harold Godwinson's brother, Seward, who had put forward his own claim to be King of England, had been rejected, and had gone away to go get Harold Hardrada to come and conquer England with his backing. So the entire family seemed to have been not so much interested in the welfare of the kingdom so much as what they could get out of it. So very much their father's children.
Yes. Yes. But he got his deserts in the end, didn't he? At the hand of a Norman sword, arrow, I should say, not sword. Yeah.
Well,
That's
a story, but it's not necessarily historically valid. But it's hard to tell about what these people deserved. I don't, I'm not going to sort of judge. Harold himself didn't do anything particularly worthy of my opprobrium, but certainly his dad and Seward seem to have spent a lot of dedicated a lot of time and energy to destabilizing the kingdom, as opposed to sort of trying to keep it together. So
yeah, they were after their own purposes, really. Anyway, William took over and he did exactly the same thing.
Yes.
And paid off his cronies and so on. So England wasn't so much. England eventually became good, but yeah, it was a terrible couple of decades, that's for sure. Anyway, so that brings us up to the Normans, which aren't Saxons. So that's where we stop.
That's where we stop.
How would you summarise what we've talked about tonight, Tony?
So
Any
this
key
is
lessons?
sort of well, the key lessons are that we tend to think today of England being this coherent whole, and of kings succeeding their dads. The son of a king automatically becomes a king in and of his own right, and that wasn't how people at this period saw it. In fact, even at the time of Richard III, one of the last medieval kings of England, the Northumbrians considered themselves culturally and racially distinct from Southerners. There was very much this divide. England was this collection of small nations that really had a very keen sense of their own identity. West Saxon, South Saxon, East Anglian. These were different countries as far as these people were concerned. And in each of those countries, there was a noble family. If you were of the noble family, you could be appointed to be king by a council. So there was a very strong sort of democratic process. You had to be approved by the Council of Nobles. Not everybody got a vote, obviously. But it's very different from what we think back on when we think back of how England worked and what England was like. It's very different. It's much more compartmentalized, and it's much more sort of fuzzy around the edges, not as well organized as we like to think of it. And sort of this process has been England gradually becoming a larger, more efficient modern state. Anyway.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And the other angle I think to make note of is that this is all part of the history of anyone who has British ancestry. And it's part of the history of a nation that's been affected by the Britons at some point. Because the British Empire was a quarter of the world at one point. So there's a lot of British culture and principles in a lot of different countries. I think most people listening to this probably have British ancestry at some point. And we all go back to Africa, of course. But it's part of our history. And I think it's important to at least know it at a high level and understand what life was like back then and what our ancestors have come through to end up with us and the cushy lifestyle we have today. And it makes you appreciate your lifestyle a little bit more, I think. But it's also, like I said at the beginning, these are fascinating stories that they're people being put into positions that might not have happened before then and might not ever happen again because technology moves on, politics changes, and so on. And it's fascinating to see humans rising to whatever challenge it is, or failing even. and you get much more of a story of what humans are like by watching history and seeing how people dealt with certain situations. And I find that fascinating personally. So I don't know if other people do, but I do.
Well, it's also somewhat romantic, right? For that 7 weeks between Easter and Whitsunday, when Alfred and his bedraggled followers were on the island of Athelney, the fate of England hung in the balance, right? The course of history as we know it to be now could have been, extremely different. At that point, the entire concept of an independent English nation might have vanished. So it's kind of interesting to look back at that incident and sort of imagine the mindset of the people who were there, without knowing just how pivotal it was. Alfred turning up to that decisive battle without knowing whether or not any of the people he'd summoned to fight with him were actually going to turn up. So there is an element of romance to these sort of watershed moments, it's that which would explain why there's a lot of coverage of them in these television series and in these discussions. There's a lot going on where an individual, even one that wasn't a noble, could turn out to be hugely influential, deciding the fate of nations.
Yes, it's staggering to think of at times sometimes, isn't it? So yes, it's and that's what makes it fascinating, and that's why I encourage people to study history, because you'll find all sorts of things that you just sometimes never even conceived of before, and you'll see that humans can even thrive or otherwise in those situations as well.
I think we're done for. I think it's important to look back on previous events and understand that these were people just like us. They may not have understood. They were doing their best to understand their surroundings and answer the scientific and philosophical and moral questions that we answered, that we try to answer today. But they were just the same. There's no, we're not more sophisticated. We're not more aware. We're not more intelligent. We are better informed on a great many things. But history is not some progression. It's not some evolution towards some final goal where we're so much better than our predecessors. The past was littered with people just like us, and we should learn from their experiences and what they, how they approach things. Learning from the past, I find endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, me too. So I think that's all we've got to talk about this bunch of Saxon Kings for tonight. I'm keen to get back to the early Saxon Kings and start from the beginning, and get into the ones, well, I guess Offa is well known, but there won't be any Alfred the Greats or anything like that. But we'll get into those, and we might have a chat more about those, because I don't know so much about those. So maybe you can help me with those a little bit more.
There was also a suggestion of talking about the Scottish at some stage, which I would.
I definitely want to talk about those. Yeah, because they have a fascinating history as well.
Yes.
What have you got coming up on your channel soon, Tony?
I'm still working on a climate denialism video. I also just put together a little short thing about how distances between places don't work. I'll see if I can turn that into a short presentation.
You mean on flat Earth?
On flat Earth, yeah. It can't, sort of, if you take the distances from Brisbane to Yakutsk, New Mexico, and Mexico City and Nairobi, you can't put them together in a flat plane. It's got to be a three-dimensional object. So just you can take the sticks and you can try and do it yourself.
Yeah, first never do it by themselves, but hey, this is a history one, I guess, so we shouldn't talk about that.
Yes.
One thing I want to make a point of is that feel free to mirror these talks on your channel as well, because you may as well get a few bucks for them as well.
Oh, my channel's not monetized, so
okay.
but very kind.
Yeah, if only to show your interest in history.
Yeah.
To your particular subscribers, although I suspect almost all of my subscribers subscribe to you as well. So
Might well be.
yes.
Okay.
So
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
It's been a pleasure as always. Yeah. All right. So I think that pretty much wraps it up. So
There's nothing left to do but cue the corgi.
You're despicable.